The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Kildee. This week, Donald Kerwin of the Center for Migration Studies on why everyone loses as Donald Trump pulls the plug on temporary protected status. Author and poverty researcher Kathryn Edin on what poor people lose when politicians do welfare reform. And Bill Press talks with Representative Dan Kildee of Michigan. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Donald Trump's recent despicable and racist comments about immigrants came as a response to an effort to maintain TPS, Temporary Protected Status. Donald Kerwin is a national authority on immigration who says the end of TPS will only lead to suffering for our most vulnerable immigrants who are hardworking, legal, and playing an important role in our nation's economy. And we say hello to Donald Kerwin, Executive Director of the Center for Migration Studies. Don Kerwin, thank you so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's our pleasure to have you with us. Now, let's start with a reminder. Let's talk about temporary protected status. What is the purpose of temporary protected status?
Well, it was a program created in 1990 basically to save the lives of designated people, national groups, who are in the United States, and there's either an armed conflict in their nation that poses a threat to their safety, or there's been some kind of an environmental disaster, an earthquake or a flood or an epidemic, and the state can't safely handle their return and has requested temporary protected status for its nationals in the U.S., or there's some other extraordinary and temporary condition that would make it unsafe to return. And I mean, there's other requirements as well, but basically those are the core requirements. So what it does is it protects people who are already in the United States. It doesn't allow anyone to enter. It's the equivalent of kind of offering, some kind of secure, safe haven to people.
Now, so far, President Trump has ended TPS for nationals from Haiti, Nicaragua, Sudan, and most recently El Salvador. What are some of the reasons these groups were granted TPS in the first place?
Well, Haiti, because of the earthquake in 2010, El Salvador, because of the earthquakes in 2001, and for Sudan, it's conflict, and for Nicaragua, it was Hurricane Mitch. And, for other countries, it's also been Hurricane Mitch, for Honduras, for example. For Syria, it's the civil war, of course. So these are very, serious conditions. And one issue is that the way that the Trump administration interprets the statute is that the Department of Homeland Security, in considering extensions, can't consider superseding conditions. It has to look at the conditions that were the basis for the original designation of temporary protected status. And that's a totally novel interpretation, and it's not at all justified by statute, and it's certainly not justified by precedent, including the precedent that extended Haiti for 6 months the last time when then DHS Secretary Kelly announced that, after carefully reviewing current conditions in Haiti, he decided to extend TPS for 6 months. So this is a new legal interpretation that's not justified, but it's a way to provide kind of a legal rationale for denying status and an extension of status to people who would clearly be at risk if they were returned home.
Well, and here I've got a problem, and I think a lot of other people would share this as well. When you've got many cases of people that have been in this country over 20 years, are working. If I'm not mistaken, some 88% of TPS folks are working. They're hardworking people. They've raised families here, and now we're just going to turn our backs on them. Why? Is there a threat that nobody knows about? I mean, this is what I find so mind-boggling.
No, there's clearly no threat because this is a group that has to get extensions every time that there's a renewal, which, is about every 18 months for these groups over many periods at this point. And you're absolutely right. For El Salvadorans, for example, which is the largest group, 88% of them are in the labor force, which is far higher, than kind of U.S. citizen participation in the labor force. And they have almost as many U.S.-born children as there are TPS beneficiaries. So you have, almost 200,000 TPS beneficiaries from El Salvador, but those beneficiaries have 193,000 U.S.-born, U.S. citizen children. So they're obviously contributing. They're obviously deeply vested in the country. And on average, they've been here for 21 years. So there needs to be a mechanism that would allow them to apply for permanent resident status. And there is legislation that would allow them to do that, but that's an uphill battle, of course.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Donald Kerwin, Executive Director of the Center for Migration Studies. Don, what are some of the conditions TPS recipients will face upon their deportation?
I mean, think about Haiti, for example. We know about the earthquake in 2010, but there's also a cholera epidemic. And there was also the disastrous, Hurricane Matthew in 2016 and kind of the tropical storm this year, 2017. In a place like El Salvador, there's whole sections of the country that are largely controlled by gangs, and it's quite clear that families that are moving back from the United States many of them will be victimized by those gangs because they'll be considered to have resources, and their children will be victimized as well, their U.S. citizen children, because it would be very useful to the gangs to recruit U.S. citizens. And so I think that it's just unconscionable to, solely for the reason that this is supposedly a temporary program, to return these people to places where they don't have prospects. A lot of them have connections anymore. They don't have much of a memory even of these places, particularly the U.S. children. And in many cases, they'd be at risk.
I mean, are we talking about splitting families up, or would the children be allowed to stay and the parents would have to leave?
I think that what's going to happen is some people will stay and they'll go underground and they'll remain unified with their families. Some TPS beneficiaries that don't, qualify for any kind of other status. But they'll, of course, be on the margins, and they'll, they won't be as productive as they can be, and they'll live under the constant threat of deportation with all those negative consequences. Some will return, some TPS beneficiaries will return home, and their U.S. citizen children will remain in the United States. Maybe they'll be with a parent, maybe they won't be with a parent, but that family unit will be broken up, and the family will lose the benefit of having the beneficiary and their income and their support through, basically into perpetuity. Mm-hmm. And that's going to drive a lot of families into poverty, and it's going to require them to move in with other people, and it's going to require them to move to other school districts, and all of that kind of disruption and suffering, really, with families that occurs when there's a deportation.
You released a statement following the president's decision to end TPS for El Salvadorans, in which you said the decision creates many losers and no winners. Is this what we're talking about, or is there more to that?
I think so. I mean, you think about the TPS beneficiaries themselves. As we've said, they're hardworking. They have U.S. citizen families. They're members of, churches. Some of them have started their own businesses so that they're employers, not just employees. And so they lose, and certainly their employers lose, and the industries in which they're concentrated lose. I think that the communities in which they live, also obviously lose. I mean, think about the highest number of TPS beneficiaries from El Salvador, for example, works in the construction industry. And large numbers of them are working right now in Houston and Florida, both of which are recovering from natural disasters and absolutely need construction workers. And so what's the logic of taking a legal population that's contributing significantly and whose work is needed and making them an undocumented population, or simply deporting them from the United States? So, I mean, it's clear that not just those communities depend on them, but, the people that are depending on their houses being rebuilt, on their lives being put back in order, they're losers. The U.S. economy is a loser. Of course, the children of TPS beneficiaries are going to lose from this. And I think that the rule of law loses, too, in a sense, because, really what you're doing is you're taking, like I said, a legal, productive, contributing, law-abiding community, and you're turning them into undocumented immigrants and putting them on the margins or forcing them to leave the United States. And in many cases, forcing them to return to situations of fairly intense and well-confirmed violence. So how that upholds the rule of law is anybody's guess.
Now, many Democratic lawmakers expressed their outrage at the decision, among them Elizabeth Warren. She's a co-sponsor of the Secure Act. What does the Secure Act propose, and is there hope for a legislative solution such as this?
Well, there's a Secure Act. It's kind of a wish list of enforcement. And that's not this Secure Act. The Secure Act that she's talking about stands for Safe Environment from Countries Under Repression and in Emergency. And really what it applies to is these TPS beneficiaries. And it would allow beneficiaries who received, a designation and qualified for TPS the last time the designation was extended, and who've been continuously present in the U.S. for 3 years at least, it would allow them to be able to apply for lawful permanent residency. And the problem, I think, with the Temporary Protected Status program, which has been a very high, successful program and has saved countless lives, is that it doesn't provide this process for long-term TPS beneficiaries to become permanent residents. Now, if they qualify for a visa, for example, based on a family connection, or if they, receive political asylum, or if there's some other path to permanent residence for them that's not TPS related, of course they can take it. But the statute itself not only doesn't provide a path to permanent residence, but it requires a supermajority vote of the Senate to actually create legislation that would do that. And so that's one of the challenges, I think, for the Secure Act. It needs 60 votes on the Senate side.
Yeah, and that's not there.
It's not there, no.
Yeah. Now, there's been some suggestion that in ending TPS, Donald Trump is actually creating a bargaining chip that he can use as he tries to gain bipartisan support for his wall and other immigration policies that he'd like to put in place. Obviously, this seems pretty cold-hearted, to say the least, but could it work for him?
Yeah, it's unclear listening to him over a year's time, and this was made even, brought into relief even more prominently recently, exactly what he wants. I mean, mostly I would judge him by what he's done, which has all been harsh and largely focused on legal migrants and legal migration programs. For example, cutting back refugee numbers and eliminating the DACA program and eliminating the Central American Minors Program, which allowed, minors to come who were deemed to be refugees in one of the Northern Triangle states to come legally to the United States if they had legally present parents in the United States. So that program's now been eliminated. And, if you look just down the line, I mean, there's a great hostility towards legal immigration. They want to eliminate or end, as he said recently, family-based immigration, or at least significantly restrict it. And they call that chain migration, but really what that is U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents with close family connections petitioning for a family member and then going through kind of an arduous process for the person. Often there's multi-year waits, sometimes even decades, for that person to get a visa. So it's all been bad in terms of legal immigrants. So I'm really not sure, like, kind of what the end game is for him, or even what he wants to accomplish at this point. I think, it's conceivable, if there's a real drive for the DREAM Act and for a larger population, hopefully, of undocumented people, and it certainly should be a much larger population. Then there's the possibility that, providing some significant funding for the border, albeit not for, a 2,000-mile wall, but to secure the border even further, would lead to some kind of a compromise that would legalize some people. But, as our research has shown, the numbers crossing the border have nosedived over a 15-year period. So why at this point you would try to build a significant wall or further extend the wall is a bit baffling to us, because right now 2 times more people enter the undocumented population by overstaying visas than by illegally crossing a border. So it's a terrible idea, but it might lead to some kind of compromise.
Okay. Don Kerwin, Executive Director for the Center for Migration Studies, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Don, thank you so much for your time with us today, and we do look forward to having you back again soon.
Thanks a lot.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Poverty researcher Kathryn Edin says more and more people in America are living on $2 a day, and welfare reform is only making it worse. We'll talk to her about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
As the royal triumvirate of Donald Trump, Paul Ryan, and Mitch McConnell continue their perverse quest to turn our America into a gold-plated Trumplandistan for oligarchs, they keep insisting that their blatantly elitist schemes will magically elevate the middle class and even the poor, delivering a 7-course dinner to everyone. Yeah, right. As we've now seen from their totally regressive new tax law, your and my 7-course dinner turns out to be a 6-pack and a possum. In fact, As the Nonpartisan Tax Policy Center reports, 10 years from now, 83% of the benefits in the Trump-Ryan-McConnell Tax Act will be flowing to the wealthiest families, while more than half of America's middle-income and poor people will actually see their taxes rise during the next decade. Meanwhile, this egregious giveaway to undeserving corporate elites will add as much as $1.5 trillion to the federal deficit. No problem, says the slap-happy triumvirate, for we have a plan to cover the cost of these lavish tax cuts we've given to the royals, including cuts for the gilded Trump family, which just happens to be one of the Act's top beneficiaries. As Trump himself explained the plan, we're going to go into welfare reform. Yes, the plan is to cut such essential safety net programs as children's health care, food stamps, jobless programs, and, as Ryan now publicly admits, they intend to cut your and my Medicare and Social Security. This is Jim Hightower saying, what we have here is plutocracy in action. The precious few are intentionally knocking down and locking down the many to further enrich themselves. This is why the social cancer of inequality is spreading so rampantly in America, devouring the very middle class that Trump and company are using, ironically and cynically, as an Orwellian rationale for passing their plutocratic agenda.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Scholar and author Kathryn Edin documents the lives of people who live on almost no cash income and says much of what we think we know about those lives is wrong. And we say hello to Kathryn Edin, a professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton and one of our nation's leading poverty researchers. Her most recent and groundbreaking book, written with Luke Schaefer, is titled $2 a Day, Living on Almost Nothing in America. Kathryn Edin, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
I'm glad to be here.
And we're happy to have you with us. I've got to say, your book, $2 a Day, just mind-boggling, just looking at the title of the book. But you began with research you were doing on how poor people put together a budget. So what did you discover that led you to write this book?
Well, I started out my career talking with low-income single mothers across the country about how they survived welfare and low-wage employment. But that was in the years before welfare reform. I did write a book on that topic, showing how difficult it was to survive, but then went on to study other things. And in 2010, I came to Baltimore for the summer to interview a group of young people who'd been born in public housing, and we've been following them ever since, and happened to run into something I had not seen before, especially back in the years that I was interviewing low-income single mothers about their budgets, and that is folks living in households with no source of cash income. And I remember the first woman I met, Ashley, it was stunning to me to just observe her in a state where she had a 2-week-old baby and absolutely no cash from work, no cash from welfare. And I knew enough about welfare reform to know the rolls had gone way down, but it just hadn't clicked that maybe some people who would have been eligible for welfare in the old days were now living virtually cashless lives. And as soon as I teamed up with Luke Schaefer, who's the numbers guy, I'm the go out and talk to him person, to look, we found that it wasn't just some people. It was a very large number of people who were raising kids and trying to work, most of them, which of course is encouraging, finding the labor market very challenging to in terms of securing a full-time, full-year job, and And while they were scrambling, they were experiencing months without any source of cash income at all.
I can't begin to fathom actually living on $2 a day. And I would assume that many of these people are receiving some kind of government assistance that does not necessarily factor into cash income. But if that's all they can rely on, what does that mean for their day-to-day lives?
Well, it's interesting. Many of them do receive some sort of food assistance, critical. Many also have someone in the household with a government health insurance plan, also critical. But you can't use your Medicaid card to pay your rent. You can't use your food stamps to pay your rent, buy your kids socks and underwear, get cough syrup. So it really puts families in a bind, not having any resource that can be used for any basic need except medical care and food. And that's really what our safety net looks like today. And so what daily life looks like is a scramble to somehow find the resources to get by. So, you really can't live on $2 a day, as it turns out. You've got to get more resources. And whether that's what Jennifer Hernandez did for a while, she would spend 10 to 12 hours a day scouring Chicago alleys for tin. And she made about $12 a day doing that. It's not a very remunerative trade. Jessica Compton in Johnson City, Tennessee, supporting her family through her blood plasma sales, which, she was able to sort of garner around $50 cash in a good week if her iron was high enough to allow her to donate. Paul Heckwilder, literally growing kind of a victory garden in his backyard out of spoiled food from the food pantry, while trying to keep house and home together when an entire family pizza business fails, and he finds 23 members of extended family suddenly under his roof with no source of cash. So survival becomes the preoccupation, the all-consuming task. And of course, when you're just focused on survival, it makes it very, very hard for you to lift your head up, look ahead, and think about how you're going to get out of the situation.
Your book goes a long way to break stereotypes we may have about people on welfare. Among them is that people on welfare do not want to work. But tell us what you found.
It's absolutely amazing. If you look at the data collected from the Census Bureau, the best data we have on the incomes of the poor, and if you take a poor child and follow that child throughout a year, 90% of the time, that child will have at least one adult in his or her household that's at least sometimes employed. And that is also true for the $2 a day poor. So we used to think that there were people who worked and people who didn't. But what we're now seeing among the poor is an incredible penetration of work. But that's matched with growing instability in the low-wage labor market. It's very, very difficult to find full-time work. Your hours can be reduced to zero at a moment's notice. And what happens when this instability begins to hit you is you oftentimes lose your housing instability. And once you lose your housing instability, it becomes very hard to get and keep work. So it's like a spiral. One source of instability in the labor market leads to another source of instability in housing. Often then times, the stress of it all makes you sick. So health begins to intervene. Sometimes family members, frankly, we saw this in our work, can be more a source of stress. They can be a cause and not a salve in times of distress. So all of these things can spiral, leading folks into extraordinarily precarious circumstances. The families. We spent, and in addition to looking at all the numbers you can look at from government statistics, we spent, many months and years with 18 families. And it was life-changing to see how, valiantly they adhered to the work ethic, how hard they sought work, and how how hard they work to keep jobs, how much they desired to be good parents. I think the most amazing thing about studying poor people is, especially if you do it firsthand, like we were able to do, is you come up against yourself. You see many of your own traits, and you do reach a point, I think, when you say, there but for the grace of God go I, you really understand in a very deep sense how precarious we all are.
We're speaking with Kathryn Edin, professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton, co-author with Luke Schaefer of the book $2 a Day, Living on Almost Nothing in America. Turning to the issue of welfare reform, Kathryn, let's go back in time. You and Luke Schaefer have tracked poverty since President Clinton's reform bill that replaced aid to families with dependent children, replaced with TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. Since that time, you see a rise in the number of families living on $2 per person per day. You spoke to poor families about TANF. What did they tell you?
Yeah, so dramatic rise in, over the course of a year now, we have about 3.5 million American children spending at least 3 months in this situation, up from a very small number prior to welfare reform. But what people say about TANF is, first, they say, this is Madonna Harris. I'm quoting her in one of our respondents in Chicago. When we asked her, she was homeless. She had no food. And we asked her why she didn't apply for TANF, and she said, "Oh, they don't give that out anymore." We heard this again and again, people just assuming that the system no longer exists. And indeed, it is now so small. There are only 600,000 adults across the 50 states on TANF now. So the information flows that people rely on to find out about things have just really atrophied in a lot of cases. The second thing they would say is, I think of myself as a worker. I want to be a worker. And if I go down and apply for welfare, that just doesn't fit who I think I am. And I think the third reaction is, if you go down there, they're going to hassle you so much, it's not even worth it. And indeed, it is shocking to realize that even if you do manage to get on the system now, the maximum you can get in an average state, if you're a mom with 2 kids and no income, is $420. That's the maximum in the average state. So you can easily understand why people would say, why go through, a system that makes you feel cheap and demeaned and bad about yourself? The psychological costs of exposing yourself to that level of shame, I think have really grown. Maybe some people think that's a good thing, keeping freeloaders off the rolls, but it can also be a bad thing if kids are exposed to situations where they are lacking food. In the book we tell the story of Tabitha Hicks and the Mississippi Delta, who is so vulnerable because her family is so hungry that she, when confronted with an inbox on her Facebook as a 9th grader from a teacher who writes to her saying, I've been watching you since you were young, waiting for you to mature, and then offers her food if she'll have sex with him after school. Oh. She was vulnerable to that in part because the need of her and her younger brothers was so great. She ended up in a liaison with her teacher for 5 months before, in desperation, she told another teacher. So I think this is the America most of us think we live in, and we do need to help find people work. We need to improve the quality of work. But we also need a safety net that catches you when you fall. If by no fault of your own you find yourself in a situation where you can't find work, you're in a region like the Mississippi Delta where work has virtually disappeared. If you're caring for a sick child or family member, we need, we need a set of supports for those folks too. So we don't create poverty traps from which people cannot crawl out. And that's what I fear based on the ethnographic work we've done, is that we've really created a poverty trap, a state so low that you can't really come back from it. We've always had, we've never really had poverty traps in the United States. But this hole in the safety net is really unprecedented. We have, since really the 30s, there's been an entitlement to assistance if you can show need. And welfare reform wipes that away. And we didn't, we weren't really looking. Everyone sort of missed what happened next. And we just happened to stumble upon it and pursue it. And that's really the origin of the book.
We don't know yet what President Trump will do about welfare reform, but we have some hints. We've heard him say that people are taking advantage of the system. Is there anything in your research to confirm that this is the problem we should be focusing on?
I keep thinking and saying, what welfare are we talking about here? The rolls are unbelievably low. Only about 1 in 20 poor families with children are even touched by the welfare system now, as opposed to about 80% in the late 70s. There are positive things, like finding more universal approaches that are less stigmatizing. There is some talk about those. There was a version of that discussion around the expanded child tax credit. I think that's positive. There's a lot of talk about block granting the rest of our safety net and ending the entitlements to aid we now have in SNAP and in Medicaid. And that's what happened in welfare reform. We ended the entitlement and we said to states, here's the money, you go innovate. And what the states did, of course, is when push came to shove, they diverted the money to other programs like funding college scholarships, crisis pregnancy centers, the child welfare system, that's a popular one, other aid to working folk. So now of that $16.5 billion that gets transferred to state, only $5 billion goes into the pockets of the needy. It's really something of a lesson and what the states can and can't do. And if you give them a flexible funding stream and you don't supervise or monitor what they do with it, they're going to find it an irresistible option, to pay for that, the expanded goodies they want to give out to their constituents. And nobody's listening to the needs of the poor. They don't have representation, as the work of Ben Page and Martin Gillen shows, to a large extent, among our elected representatives. So their voices are silent. They can be heard without anyone noticing. That's why an entitlement rather than a block grant is so important. So I think that's a big threat. Another threat is requiring work among SNAP recipients. Work is just really hard to get and keep. It's just something we in the middle class don't really understand, but the bottom of the labor market is really frayed. The quality of jobs are perilously low in many cases. There are jobs that are maybe suitable for teenagers, but not for parents raising kids. And if we're going to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to create an even deeper level of extreme poverty. SNAP is really our only cash safety net, it's not a cash safety net, but it's our only safety net left. It's the only part of our system that catches you when you fall, that you actually get more of when you have less money. So really what we're going to do if we end up making SNAP contingent on work is we're going to exacerbate. And right now we can claim, well, at least we have SNAP.
Right.
But that would really be a harsh remedy. And we know, for example, that even now SNAP doesn't last through the month. And in that last week where families don't have any SNAP left, we know that kids' performance in school declines. I don't think we want kids school performance to suffer due to a lack of food because their parents can't find a job.
Mm. It's tough to think. Pardon me. It's tough to think about, but it's something that we really need to address, and we seemingly keep getting further away from it. And the stereotypes, while your book has done a great job to break those, they're still out there, and they almost seem to be the impetus for some of the stripping away of these programs.
Yeah. Jared Bernstein wrote a really good op-ed, I think yesterday, reminding us all about what these stereotypes are ultimately about. In the United States, they're deeply racially coded. And when we think welfare, we think minority, we think these people are lazy. So, it's racism is the sort of the Achilles heel of our American democracy. It's the American dilemma.
Yeah.
And it shows up. It shows up reliably in discussions about welfare.
Kathryn Edin, professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton, co-author with Luke Schaefer of the book, $2 a Day, Living on Almost Nothing in America. Kathryn, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We do look forward to having you back again soon, and hopefully we can talk about some improvements in America as far as the poverty situation goes.
I certainly hope so. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. Thank you. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Congressman Dan Kildee of Michigan.
Congressman Dan Kildee from Michigan. Congressman, what do you think about this Oprah flap? I mean, the headline, New York Times today, Oprah 2020, the idea makes Democrats giddy.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, I think it's a reflection of how anxious we are to engage and to get rid of Donald Trump. And it's easy for us to kind of get ahead of ourselves. 2018 ought to be our singular focus. And
Amen.
2020 is important, and lots of things can happen between now and then. The fact that in one way or another we have people who are anxious to sort of engage that fight that go beyond sort of conventional political figures, that's good news. But let's focus on 2018 and take one step at a time.
Right.
But let me just get one thing straight. You went, just for a change of pace, you left Washington to go to a place where there are these odd-looking, oversized creatures that move really slow. That was a change of pace?
Well, in many ways, when I was around the giant tortoises, Congressman, it did make me think of some members of Congress.
Did you nickname some of them? Turtle Don? That could catch on.
That could catch on, yeah.
That's a good, for a president that's as good as nicknames as he is,
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That iguana looks a lot like Don Jr.
Yeah, let's not talk about the blue-footed boobies.
Anyway, I digress.
Yes, we do. But I want to go back to Oprah for just a second. I mean, I guess I totally agree, and I made that point earlier in the program. Let's talk 2018, folks. Mm-hmm. Let's get the House back. Let's get the Senate back. But it is interesting, this sudden burst of enthusiasm for Oprah. I mean, I'm a big Oprah fan, have been for a long time.
Right.
But it does raise the question, is the answer to a TV celebrity becoming president having our own TV celebrity?
Yeah.
I would say not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Right? I mean, I think the differences between Donald Trump and Oprah Winfrey are legend. And, if you're going to have someone whose background is not in government, who happens to be a celebrity, it would be better if they actually were self-made, had some intelligence, reads from time to time, and is humble. Mm-hmm. And the difference
has some empathy.
Has some empathy. And, the two of them are different in each of those ways.
Right, yeah.
And those, I think, are bigger differences than the difference between a person who comes from government or who comes from another sector.
Yeah, no, well said. And the other thing is, I was on CNN yesterday, and people were making the argument that, well, this just shows how weak the Democratic field is. I beg to differ. I mean, it's not like the potential Democratic field for 2020, and again, we're way early.
Yeah,
is not without a good, strong list of very capable people. Whether you're talking about Bernie or Joe Biden or Elizabeth Warren or Kirsten Gillibrand or Cory Booker, or Andrew Cuomo, go down the list, right?
We kind of go through this every 4 years because it always feels like the list of candidates is somewhat obscure, but you go back in history, and we have elected many presidents that 3 or 4 years before the election, they were not very well known by anyone. You could certainly say that about either Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, that's for sure. Mm-hmm. Neither of them were particularly well known. So I think we ought to be careful about that, because I think you're right. If we just look at the raw talent of the names of the people who are the more conventional names that are being discussed, there are some really talented people. I know many of them personally, so maybe
right. No. But we all know them. Not all, but in Washington, you get to know them, right? Many of them been guests on the program here, and it's a very, very talented field.
And even some of my colleagues who, some would say, well, House members don't typically do this.
Ryan.
But Tim Ryan. He's certainly getting out there and creating some momentum, some energy.
Yeah.
Another one of my colleagues, who's a classmate of mine, who's running, John Delaney from Maryland, is a really smart guy and is contributing a lot to this conversation.
Absolutely,
so,
he's been in the studio here.
Yeah. So I think there are some folks out there that might surprise people.
Right. I have to ask you. Let's just talk politics here for a little bit. I know we have more serious things to talk about. Dennis Kucinich, running for Governor of Ohio.
Hey, I remember when Dennis was elected mayor of Cleveland, and a lot of folks thought
the boy mayor,
20-something.
He was early 20s, wasn't he?
He was. He was really well. He was on the city council even before that. I remember because I was a really young public official. I got elected when I was 18 years old. And so Dennis was a person I looked at.
Why'd you wait so late?
I know. Well, I had to wait,
So you got out of high school?
Right.
I graduated from high school. I'm going to run for office.
Yeah, my high school principal was
You were elected to what when you were 18?
The Board of Education.
Really?
So I literally went from being a student in the classroom to being the boss of the superintendent in a matter of a very short period of time.
Boy.
To use the term that we now hear a lot.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of what I was doing when I was 18. It wasn't running for office.
Well, I did wear my best navy blue African dashiki to my first school board meeting. Yeah, it was a look. Yes. It went with the hair.
Yes.
The beard. And just in the neighboring town, I was the second 18-year-old to be elected to the Board of Education in my county.
Was this Dan's revenge?
Yes, that's right.
Against the superintendent? Against your principal?
There was a bit of that going on.
Oh, that's weird. We haven't seen any of those pictures there.
But as outrageous as I sort of looked, the fact that my neighbor and lifelong friend, Michael Moore, was on the school board in Davison, Michigan, made me look like Winston Churchill as compared to him.
He was elected.
That's how that's how Michael and I really became.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
No, I had never heard that story before.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, Peter, I'm with you. Pictures?
Yeah.
It was pre-digital era. Thank God Almighty.
Somewhere there's a lockbox in his office. The pictures of him in a dashiki.
Aren't you lucky? So, yeah, you're back. Your colleagues are back. It's January. Nothing to do this month, huh?
My gosh. If there's anything that says that Republicans can't govern, it's the fact that they have not been able to do something as simple as pay the light bill and keep the doors open for more than a few weeks at a time. Think about that. Just a few weeks at a time.
Yeah.
It now looks again like there's the possibility they're floating it out. Tom Cole said something yesterday, a more reasonable Republican who's on the Appropriations Committee, about the possibility of another short-term spending bill.
That's all they do. It's like 2 or 3 weeks, as you say, 2 or 3 weeks at a time. So the last one was December 21, wasn't it? Or December what?
Yeah, it was December. It went to, I think it was, because we finished on the 22nd, so it must have been right around
And they
then.
booted till January
19th.
all the way to January 19th.
For 3 weeks of funding. This is where basically a little more than 3 weeks of funding. And, the problem with this is...
How could you run a business that way?
Oh, my God. You can't run a government that way. You certainly can't run any business that way. And, it's so interesting because the Republicans, in pushing the tax bill, one of their conjured arguments, which doesn't completely fall apart, is that the markets need certainty. Well,
yeah.
I mean, what kind of certainty do you get when the best you can hope for is that the largest, most significant democracy on the planet, well, not largest, but a certainly most significant economy on the planet, can't keep its government doors open for more than a few weeks at a time? I mean, that's pathetic.
No, there's no. I've heard that certainty argument for so long, right?
Yeah.
And that's why Republicans have to be in charge.
And they don't believe. I mean, they fundamentally don't believe in the protections that government provide people, and so it's not that big a deal to them.
Right.
For the folks who are suffering as a result, who can't depend on the basic elements of government being in place for them, for medical research that's being conducted. How do you conduct longitudinal research on unlocking or cracking the code on these terrible diseases?
I think you and I have talked before too about infrastructure. I mean, it used to be like with the transportation bill, 5 years ahead because they know it takes that long to plan a project, to get all the pieces in place, right? Boom, 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 right?
Now it's just government is just an afterthought.
So that I guess the other reality is, while you're focused on how we can keep the government running for another 2 or 3 weeks, there are a lot of other issues that are not being addressed.
Right. A lot. I mean, some big ones and some sort of created issues. Like, I don't think we should dismiss the importance of DACA, but let's just remember that it wasn't like the DACA issue was a deadline that someone else created. President Trump, Donald Trump, the stable genius himself, decided that he was going to end DACA and create a deadline, create a crisis, create uncertainty for these 800,000, which is, morally a questionable act at the least. But then to use that leverage that he created by deciding that in order to get something that's very unpopular, he will threaten to deport 800,000 people who only know this country. How that is not seen as a moral affront to what the American people actually believe, especially when something in the neighborhood of 300 members of the House would vote for codification of DACA if it were placed on the floor.
That high, you believe?
I believe so. Just based on conversations. I haven't done a whip count.
Right.
But based on discussions, if it's a reasonable piece of legislation that was essentially codified DACA, it would pass with big numbers.
So what Donald Trump is saying right now, okay, I'll give you DACA. We'll protect the Dreamers. He's actually made statements in the past about how I love the Dreamers. I want to help the Dreamers. Now he's saying, yep, okay, you can have the Dreamers. All I want is my price is $18 billion for the wall. Should Democrats make that deal?
No, because, first of all, that's a path that once we begin to go down, that we essentially would say that we will be subject to what is political blackmail. There's deal-making in the space of government that I understand. You get your bridge, I get my toll road, whatever. There's all sorts of things that don't have a deep moral element, that don't have a lot of overarching principle underneath them. But the idea that a monument to his campaign promise that he'll build this great wall should be funded by taxpayer dollars in exchange.
Because part of the promise was not only to build the wall, but to build the wall paid for by the Mexican government.
Which, for some reason, he's circling back to that occasionally, which is a little bizarre,
Yeah, because we know it's never going to happen.
Yeah, maybe he's forgotten that. Who knows? But the idea that the kind of trade-off that is being proposed is a threat to 800,000 people. And let's be clear about what that threat is. It is a threat to deport them to countries that, for the most part, they don't know, they don't understand, in many cases don't speak the language.
And they never lived in.
And never lived in, except maybe as very young children.
Right.
Once in a while, we have to remind ourselves that there's a moral element to the work that we do, that this is not just another real estate deal where you trade one building for another. These are human beings. These are people. And he doesn't seem to have an empathetic bone in his body. I don't think he understands that. I don't think he can get his head around the notion that inflicting pain and suffering on human beings is morally wrong. And he has chosen to inflict that suffering. It's not something where there's a terrible tragedy that maybe was not preventable. He made the decision to put these people, these young people, these dreamers, in a position of losing everything they know and everything they understand in order to get something which on its face is just kind of stupid. But it's a promise to the 30% who still think he's both stable and genius. And even many Republicans who represent border states say, well, the wall is really not exactly what we need. Do we want to have border security? Of course we do.
Yeah.
But the idea that we would have the Trump monument, the Great Wall of Trump, in order to sort of celebrate his bizarre, repeated campaign promises that there will be a wall built by Mexico, it's a wall too far.
Isn't there? There's at least one other issue in this. In the negotiations about keeping the government going, and that is the CHIP program.
Right.
Now, that was extended again, but just temporarily, right?
Right. Extended for the states that had money that was about to run out.
Yeah, right.
So like my own home state of Michigan, because each of them are on different schedules, our money wouldn't run out till April or May, so we did not get any of that short-term extension. As it stands right now, even that extension runs out in March.
And if I can, just to pick up your word about morality, I mean, when it comes to health care for children, it's hard to believe that this would become a political football.
My message to Republicans and to Donald Trump, and I'm sure he's listening.
Well, that's what he does.
Yes, that's
until
right.
11 o'clock.
Until 11
morning.
o'clock.
Right.
You have your political fights, play your political games. Leave the kids out of it. Just leave the kids out of it. Even parents who are going through a horrible divorce typically can kind of find some common ground when it comes to the kids.
Yeah.
We ought to be able to find common ground when it comes to these kids, whether they're dreamers or kids who, for the first time in a long time since CHIP, since Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy came together on something, they've been able to go to the doctor and go to the dentist. For God's sake, why would we threaten to take that away from them, especially when CHIP, in the long term, if we want to start talking about dynamically scoring policy like tax policy, CHIP, in the long term, saves us all enormous financial resources.
Sure.
You get a kid into the doctor when they can get some preventive health care. My gosh, it's just the moral dimension ought to be enough. But even for people who want to just look at it from a pure economic dollars and cents standpoint, it's smart money. It's really smart money. So
it's like preventive health care.
It is. Yeah. No question about it.
For these kids, I mean, the idea, again, you would hold them hostage, like we're holding the dreamers hostage.
And of course, the irony is the way the House wanted to pay for CHIP reauthorization was by cutting preventive health care from other people. Mm-hmm. So it was not a good choice, and it was a bad. But we ought to just do a straight CHIP reauthorization. Should have done it back in the summer. But I think the Republicans saw an opportunity to use these kids as leverage to get something that otherwise they wouldn't be able to get. And of course, what is that? That's a budget that defunds pretty essential priorities. They really want to starve the beast. That's, I think, why they passed the tax code in the way they did.
Right. We've talked before about about the state of the American economy. I think it's really interesting, if not bizarre, these days. So the Dow is doing. I mean, not that the Dow is an accurate reflection of the entire economy.
Right.
It certainly is not. But it just won't stop. It seems every day is another. Or every other day is a new fight. It's over 25,000 right now. How do you explain that? I mean, should we be giving Donald Trump credit for that?
Well, I mean, I think one of the ways we explain it is that there are results from recovery. Climbing out of the recovery has strengthened the stock exchange. The other, though, I think this is
8 years of recovery.
8 years of
Barack
recovery.
Obama.
And in fact, while the president was falling all over himself and his people around themselves for the job numbers, I mean, 2016 was a better year than 2017 was. So, I mean, let's sort of keep things in perspective. We're for all of this. We want to see continued growth. But I think your initial point is the right one. The Dow is not the ultimate determinant of the quality of the economy. It is a factor. There's no question about it because it's a reflection. But we know from past experience that sometimes run-up in the markets can be followed by disaster if the fundamentals aren't right.
Yeah.
And, I think Greenspan referred to it once as irrational exuberance. I don't think that's what's happening right now because this is not like a dot-com bubble. But it does cause some concern when we don't really deal with what most businesses see as the fundamental challenge. I visit a lot of small businesses, which is really the engine of our economic growth.
Absolutely.
And I used to think, especially when I first got here and I was on the Financial Services Committee, I heard a lot about, access to capital. And a lot of the companies I talked to, they had cash. But you know what they couldn't, what was the biggest thing preventing them from growing their business and reaching additional markets? It wasn't the Export-Import Bank, although I support that. It wasn't the lack of capital. It was the lack of skilled workforce. And so what are we doing about that? We're actually about to reduce the federal commitment to apprenticeship programs, to worker retraining programs, to community colleges, to K-12, support for vocational education. All the stuff that you would do if you were actually trying to fill that void to grow the economy. So I worry about the underlying fundamentals eventually working against growth and against increased wages. One of the reasons wages are not going up is the structure of the economy is changing, and we're not filling in where the holes are, where the high value jobs are. It's in those areas where some skills are actually required. Especially in advanced manufacturing, we're about to actually go in the wrong direction on that.
Yeah. It's interesting that in talking to these small businesses and in terms of making their decision to expand or not to expand, you did not mention, or they did not mention to you, we're waiting for the tax cut.
Didn't come up.
Yeah.
Now.
As you say, or nor the cash, because they're sitting on so much cash today.
Right.
American corporations in general, at any rate.
I don't think I ever talked to anybody who said they wouldn't accept a tax cut.
Of course.
Right. But at the end of it all, when I ask, what do you need? I mean, one of the things they said was, for a while, deal with some of the problems in healthcare because this is killing me. I got that, and we should have, and we there's a lot we could do on that. But the one that I heard that was repetitive was skilled workers. That's the impediment, and that's something we hear all over the country. But this Congress and this president, you wouldn't even think it was an issue.
I don't let you leave without getting an update on your great city of Flint, Michigan. We don't talk about Flint anymore. In the media, we have a attention span of a gnat, right? Talk about it for 24/7 for like 2 or 3 days, and then boom, move on.
It's interesting you'd raise it. I raised this in our leadership meeting yesterday, our Democratic leadership meeting.
So how are the people of Flint doing, and are they?
It's a slow and painful recovery, and we're not there yet. The water is getting better, but the result of that crisis, the health care needs of kids, the economic impact on the city, which has just been devastating, those are not getting the attention. And interestingly enough, much of the health support for kids that are Flint kids who are struggling with the impact of lead exposure, delivered through the CHIP program.
Oh, yeah. Oh, there, of course. There goes the CHIP program.
So you're right. It's not only are we not talking about it, but this administration.
Can people drink the water now out of the faucet, or are they still on?
People don't trust it. So a lot of folks use bottled water. If a person has a filter in their home, and it's properly managed, they typically could drink it, but most people don't trust it yet.
And what are we doing about the wider problem of so many other cities around the country with lead pipes?
Absolutely nothing. I mean, the idea that Flint would not have been seen as the warning that it really represented.
A wake-up call, right.
And so two things. One, we're not doing big infrastructure. That's what we should be doing. Second thing, we had an update to the lead and copper rule, which is the rule that governs this issue of lead in water, an update that was just about ready to be implemented, and the Trump administration has said not so fast. So even on the enforcement side of federal guidelines, they're taking a bit of a step back at the EPA. No surprise there.
No surprise. Probably because that rule was promulgated under the Obama administration.
Right.
And anything done under the Obama
has
administration
to be wrong. Yeah.
Has to be wrong.
Yeah.
And has to be undone.
Sadly.
God. All right. Well, we can keep fighting the good fight, Congressman.
We will.
All right. Thanks so much. Great to see you. Happy New Year. We've got lots to get done. Let's hope in 2018 on the political front, and you'll be helping lead the way.
Absolutely.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Donald Kerwin, Kathryn Edin, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.